until recently, the only way we had to determine the flight patterns of honeybees, whether workers or drones, was by beelining, either from the colony or at a food or water source. However, recently we began to use the radar to study these patterns, especially of the drone flight patterns. Now, the drones fly only in the afternoon, but earlier in the day we could see that we were seeing the flight patterns of some workers, and we even managed to catch one swarm in motion with the radar. Now, under most conditions, the vegetational features interfere with the worker flight. The radar sees the bushes as well as the bees. However, under certain conditions, like here in Arizona, the worker flight can be above this vegetational interference. So the drone flight now is above the worker flight, and most of the drone flight was visible without interference from the vegetation.
The USDA ARS Entomological Radar Unit was assembled and operated by ARS agricultural engineer Wayne Wolf. Working with Dr. O.R. Taylor, Jr. and Dr. GM Loper, the radar's first use with honeybees was in eastern Kansas, where foraging bees and drones were observed. In Arizona, the short vegetation and early honeybee season, March to April, facilitated the use of this radar for observing honeybees. One major advantage of radar is that it permits non-intrusive documentation of bees in natural flight without introducing any artificial or pheromonal cues to the study subjects. Although the response of drones to queen pheromones was observed to assure that the insect targets were indeed drones. The X-band radar has a 4-foot diameter parabolic dish, usually turned at a rate of 1 to 3 seconds per rotation. The range and bearing of insect targets is displayed on a short persistence cathode ray tube. For this project, the images were recorded using 16mm black and white motion picture film exposed at the rate of 1 frame per dish rotation. Moisture in the bee's body reflects radar energy back to the dish. The returning signal from each bee is displayed as an individual white dot on the screen. Using radar, it was possible in this project to track bees and record both their movements and direction from as far as 1.5 kilometers through an entire circle, unless some terrestrial interference, such as trees, blocked the radar's line-of-sight view. The research was conducted in a region of the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona, about 40 kilometers northwest of Tucson. Mean elevation in the Avra Valley study site was approximately 650 meters. This is an aerial view of the location where an apiary of 70 bee colonies were foraging on mesquite. This is what the radar saw. Literally thousands of workers were observed in all directions. Yet within this area, distinct lines of bees 500 meters long were seen moving in dramatic concert. At various times, streams of workers returning to the apiary were tracked flying as high as 24 and even 40 meters above ground. When headed outbound against a wind, foragers flew closer to the ground. In returning, they took advantage of the wind by flying much higher than had been earlier thought. The radar tracked a swarm in motion as it traveled 350 meters across a fallow field. The swarm flew at 11 kilometers per hour into a slight breeze and flew right past a pheromone-baited swarm trap to land on a small bush in the desert. While the literature contains narrative descriptions of drone congregation areas, or DCAs, we've never actually seen them until now. With radar, for the first time, researchers photographed both DCAs and flyways. The images show DCAs are generally circular in cross-section and about 80 to 100 meters in diameter. Flyways ranged from 20 to 100 meters in width and literally extended for several kilometers alongside strong vegetational features, such as tree lines in a wash. The flyways branched at places where apparently the drones perceived new features within 200 to 300 meters. Typical DCA activity occurred at most of these branch points. That is, instead of the drones flying unidirectionally between 20 and 35 meters above the ground, once they arrived in the DCAs, the drones changed directions, maneuvered rapidly, and flew higher, up to 60 meters above the ground. In three-dimensional terms, as this computer animation shows, their flight patterns within the DCA described a cone, the diameter of which decreased from 100 meters at the bottom to approximately 15 meters at the top. No drones were seen flying between DCAs at the higher elevations. Among the first DCAs found, these three proved unique. Drones entered from the south, forming one DCA at the branch point. Only 160 meters to the northeast, a second DCA formed. About 120 meters to the northwest, a third DCA formed. Drone activity was so great at times that at lower levels, two DCAs actually joined and looked like a single DCA 250 meters long. But by tilting the radar beam upward, it became clear that the two DCAs each maintained their distinctive cone shapes at higher elevations. It was interesting to compare the drone activity in these DCAs northeast of the radar site to what was observed in this non-DCA area. As drone flight increased from the apiary, drone activity increased greatly in the DCAs. When a queen was elevated into the DCA and moved beyond its boundaries, drones followed only slightly outside the DCA, unless the queen was kept within the flyway or moved into the wind. This sequence shows a plume of drones over 400 meters downwind from a queen pheromone lure being walked into the wind. Although early literature indicated that DCAs formed only in hilly or mountainous terrain where many strong visual cues were available, as you can clearly see from this aerial view, the 4 by 1.5 kilometer study area in the Avra Valley is virtually flat. And it was here that researchers were able to locate on the radar screen as many as 8 distinct DCAs simultaneously and found at least 28 individual DCAs interconnected with more than 12 kilometers of drone flyways. By piecing together all the flyways and DCAs found in this area, the researchers have constructed a map of drone activity observed using radar. Typically in the early afternoon, drones began to leave their colonies and disperse along available vegetational features in all directions. Interestingly, mark and recapture experiments revealed a great deal of directional uniformity in the drones' day-to-day flight patterns. Those drones caught going north were rarely caught to the south, and vice versa. As drone flight increased, flyways extended to greater distances from the apiary, with accumulation in the nearby DCAs. When the number of drones in an area was limited, either because it was early in the season or late in the season, or because there were only a few colonies present, a virgin queen was most likely to find drones in a DCA. But when thousands of drones are available, as for example around apiaries and many feral colony sites, there are probably more drones in the flyways than in the DCAs. Under such conditions, obviously mating can occur outside the DCAs. Drones have to return to a colony after 30 to 60 minutes of flight to obtain energy for another flight. So by mid-afternoon, drones were seen flying in both directions in the flyways. Later in the afternoon, drone activity in the DCAs began decreasing. This occurred first at the more distant DCAs, with most of the drones returning in the direction of the apiary.
In summary then, we see that radar has permitted us to study some significant aspects of drone flight behavior and mating biology in honeybees. In the future, it should also be possible to look at the response of drones downwind from the source of queen pheromone and individual components of the queen pheromone in bioassays versus the live queen, for example. In fact, other insects, moths, should be possible to use in a similar study. What this means is that now entomologists have an extremely capable and non-intrusive method to study the insect flight behavior. This should open up a number of possible research areas that are very important to both economic agriculture and basic biology of insects.